So we've covered color as light and as pigment. We've covered hue contrast and intensity contrast. We've covered the properties of both the subtractive and the additive system, the subtractive being hue, value, and intensity, and the additive system being hue, luminance, and saturation. We have covered the idea of intensity contrast and atmospheric perspective and how intensity pops forward visually and neutrality sits backward. It has a receding motion. Now we are talking about value, which is the third property of the subtractive system and is one of the 7 color contrasts. Value is simply the perception of lightness or darkness of a color. It is not the same thing as brightness and dullness. So bright, dull, light, dark, those are different contrasts, different properties. A color can be light and bright and dull and light. So value refers to the lightness or darkness of a hue or a color. Value relationships are how we see form. We don't really need chroma to perceive form. If you look at a black and white photograph, you will understand that form is easily perceived, easily understood, and recognized just via light and dark, via value separations between different shapes. Color's not necessary. If you wake up early in the morning, before you turn the lights on, or before the sun comes up, you're not navigating via chromatic relationships, you're navigating via light-dark. So night vision is primarily light-dark. Value is a property in the subtractive system, is the opposite or inverse to luminance, which is the idea in the additive system. So meaning it's inverse. If something is high luminance, it is low value. If something is low luminance, it's high value. So things that are on the lighter end of the value scale would be higher in luminance but lower in value. Things that are on the darker end of the value scale will be higher in value, lower in luminance. So less light is reflecting from the surface and more light's reflecting from the surface. When you have values that are similar, so you have two different colors, whether they're bright dull or equal brightness or equal neutrality, side by side, if they're the same value or close to it, you're not going to be able to perceive the boundaries of those shapes as easily. When you have similar values, you get vague or what's known as lost boundaries. Value is generally expressed in a grayscale. And as you can see here, there is a grayscale going from white to black. We have white, we have our light grays, we have our middle grays, and we have our dark grays, and we have black. Every color and every hue has a value correspondent. So every color that we deal with has a assignment of lightness or darkness. When we talk about normal value, we're talking about the value of a spectral level color, meaning a hue. So we're talking about the value of hues on the hue circle before they are tinted, shaded, toned, and neutralized and create other colors. Normal value is the value of color at full intensity, and that would basically mean spectral or hue level. The top diagram, the hue circle, is showing all the chroma. That same circle has been converted to grayscale below, and so we see that yellow is the lightest of the hues at normal value, violet is the darkest of the hues at normal value. When we get into red and red-orange and red-violet, we're starting to look at similar values if we look across the hue circle to their complements. Yellow is never as light as white. Violet is never as dark as black at normal value. To modify value, we can take the same steps that we took to modify intensity. If we're going to lighten it, we will add white or the perception of white. To darken, we will shade it by adding black. Here is a value scale using red, and we can see that saturation is out here on the right hand side, and then we have white, which is high luminance, 0% value, 100% luminance, and we're adding white incrementally to the red. and we are decreasing the red's value at the same time, as we discussed last week, we're also decreasing its intensity. The value of the original red is a lot darker than the value of the white, by the way, so don't look at this as a value correspondent. The red actually will fit more into this range of gray. So this is a grayscale here on the left, going from white to black, and the various increments of gray between. And then we have the tones. All in here are the tones and the shades, and up top here we have the tints. So we can modify value through tinting, shading, and toning. And remember from our last discussion that toning, depending upon the value of the gray that you're adding in, will or will not modify the value of the color. Toning, tinting, and shading will always modify the intensity. This is a digital hue circle, and the normal value hues are actually halfway out toward the edge from the center, and they continue lightening with being tinted, and going toward the center they are shaded. So you can see within the red range you're getting into the pinks, you're getting into the burgundies. Within the blue range you're getting into the sky blues, and then into the navy blues. One of the things about chromatic value, meaning value of a color, when you change it to black and white, you will immediately see the difference between the chromatic understanding and the achromatic. If there is detail in the chromatic that is the same value, those value differences will be lost when you change to grayscale, so you won't see quite as much detail. Like there's some very subtle variations here in the shadow of the jacket, which you don't pick up here because the values are similar. Another thing to understand about value is just kind of like chroma, hue contrast. We see it in a relative state. It's always seen in relationship to. And so our perception of something's lightness or darkness may not be accurate without first understanding the surrounding color. So here we have a grayscale with a gray strip superimposed on top. And if you'll notice toward the left end, that gray strip appears dark on the lighter colors. And you notice on the right end that it looks light on the darker colors. The gray strip itself is not changing. It's the same gray. But we are perceiving a gradation from dark to light because the ground behind it is gradating from dark to light. And it's a very obvious inverse relationship. The lighter the ground, the darker the color will be perceived on it. The darker the ground, the lighter the color will be perceived. So that gray strip that's sitting there is the same color from end to end. It just appears to be lighter, and then it appears to be darker. We've already had a brief discussion about the idea of black, white, and gray being achromatic, meaning without chroma. A mid-value gray does not create an after image. It is entirely balanced. The after image of black is white, the after image of white is black. A mid-value gray has nowhere to go. It's totally in balance. You need no compensation for it. And that's why it's a really good idea to have a gray ground on your desktop display, because you will see colors accurately. If you're working in Photoshop or Illustrator and you've got a blue ground or some brightly colored wallpaper, you should change that to a mid-value gray. It will be much more restful for your eyes and will not cause you to perceive color incorrectly. Value contrast is, of course, the understanding of the difference between lightness and darkness. So if we're comparing something, when you compare, you are dealing with things that are in common. When you contrast, you are dealing with things that are different. Value contrast is differences in lightness and darkness. High contrast can give you a lot of excitement in an image, a lot of crispness and a lot of clarity. High contrast uses everything from white to black and all the gray possibilities in between. Low contrast truncates that. Low contrast can be a lot of light grays and white. It can be a lot of mid grays It can be a lot of dark grays and black. So low contrast exists several different places on the value scale. Basically what we're doing is that we are reducing the range. We're reducing the number of different values. If you have just white and black, that is high contrast. If you have white, 3 middle grays, and a black, that's also high contrast. So contrast deals with the range of value that you have within an image. So here we have a photo that's fairly high contrast. We have almost white, some blacks, and we have a range of grays. Now, it was taken on kind of a dull day, so everything is naturally kind of grayed out. Compare that to that idea. Creating a greater sense of fogginess, I have lightened the darker areas and darkened the lighter areas. Notice also lost some detail. I just threw in, I think it's a 30% gray screen over it, but it reduces the value contrast. So now we no longer have a full range. We have a limited range, and it's closing in on the middle values rather than the lighter or the darker values. One of the things about contrast is that it is independent of the brightness and dullness idea. This is the original photograph, and of course we have the brilliant blue ground, slightly shaded. On the figure itself we have shades of blue, and then we have these bright red feet. Evidently he was out on the beach a little too long and got the bottoms of his feet sunburned. But if we translate this directly into grayscale, we notice that the feet and the blue ground, what was red and what is blue, are now the same value. Losing chroma, the feet are no longer emphasized, but the figure is emphasized because it's darker than the ground. Here the figure has some emphasis because it's darker than the blue ground, but the red feet pop because they have this nice opposing contrast to the blue, and they're highly saturated. Here it's a very different story. The feet are lost altogether. We have lost boundaries because the value contrast is not enough to separate the feet from the background. Another thing about value is the idea of key. Key comes out of a photography concept where you have a high key image, a mid key image, or a low key image. So let's take a look. Value key is the overall impression of lightness or darkness that's in an image or a design. It's the overall impression. Is the image light? Is it dark? Or is it kind of halfway between? If it's a high key image, that's overall light. A dark image is low key, and mid key dominates on the middle grays. And you can have a full range of value contrast in any one of these different keys. So you can have high key, high contrast. You can also have high key, low contrast. You can have low key, high contrast, and low key, low contrast. So we look at this photograph, we would call this mid key. It's dominating on middle grays. They take up the greater proportion of the image area. It is also high contrast because there's really close to black and really close to white in the image. One of the ways we use the idea of key is to help create mood or establish voice in a design. And so if we look at the book cover on the left, the Mercy Papers, that's high key. There's no corresponding gray in there that goes really beyond a 50% gray. Everything is on the lighter end. The book cover in the middle is mid-key. It dominates on the middle ground values. We do have white and we do have black, but between the blue and the gray and the dirt, the greater proportion of that design is mid-key, where the chromatic colors correspond to mid-value grays. And then the poster on the right would be considered low-key. It is high contrast. We have black and white, and we have a middle value red. In other words, the red is normal value, but its corresponding chromatic value is middle gray. It's overall dark proportionately with very little light areas, and therefore it's low-key. And as you look at these three and compare, you can get a sense of the different mood or the different voice of each one. In the Penguin book cover on the left, we have high contrast, mid-key. It does use grays directly, but the red and the darker blue translate into mid-value grays. And then the P.D. James Innocent House and the Penguin's 70th anniversary moniker pop forward off the gray because of value contrast. They're lighter than the ground. The red pops forward because of brightness out of the gray ground. And it's also lighter than the gray. It's not quite so light compared to the blue bar down there at the bottom. And then we have the poster, which is actually not high contrast because the blue is close to a 60% gray, and then we have white. So we have limited the range of value contrast. We can still read the lettering very easily coming off the blue ground, but it is not high contrast. There's nothing as dark as black in that poster. This is a Paul Rand design, and it's a book cover. It's overall high key. The majority of the values are in the mid-range to light, and the patch of black is, of course, giving that full range of contrast, but the key is high key. On the left, we have this image that is really dark. It's low key. It's mostly black and dark grays, but it is high contrast because we have whites. The page on the right, in contrast to the one on the left, is high key. The majority of the ground is white, and we have a full range of value, so it is high key, high contrast. So both of these are high contrast. The page on the left is low key, the page on the right is high key. So we look at this color study on the left, we have a sense that there's some really dark colors and some really light colors. As we translate that into gray, we'll discover that it is a mid-key design, little bit of lightness in the middle and along the top edge, but everything else corresponds to mid-value grays. So it's a mid-key design. One of the ways we use value contrast, not only to create a voice or a mood, but to enter into information hierarchy, visual reads, first read, second read, third read. What do you want people to see first, second, and third in your design? So we use value in partnership with saturation and intensity contrast to create emphasis within a design. When you're dealing with value selection digitally, you're dealing with it in terms of the color picker. And remember that earlier screen where we saw the red and the grayscale on the left and the tones and the tints and the shades. This is that idea, but in a digital understanding and in the actual understanding of how color blends into itself. There are no hard and fast boundaries between hues or between any color that one can make from the hue circle. So up over here we have total saturation. Over here, all along this edge, we have zero saturation, but it's only value, so we have light to dark. And so we have our lightest red, which notice is darker than the white. And here we have our darkest red possibility. There is chroma down here in the right corner. There's red, but it's the same value as the black. We have our tints, we have our shades, and all in the middle we have our grays, our tones.